The blizzard that trapped Julia Hale on Bitterroot Pass in the winter of 1878 should have killed her. And later she would say, it was the closest thing to dying she had ever known that still let her keep her eyes open to see the world afterward. She had been 3 days out from Missoula, riding the mule she had bought with the last of her father's inheritance money, when the sky over the Bitterroot Mountains turned the color of a bruise, and the wind came down off the peaks like something with teeth. Julia was 24 years old, a trained midwife and herbalist from Philadelphia who had spent the last 2 years working her way west, town by town, tending to the sick and the birthing and the dying in places where doctors were a rumor more than a reality. She carried with her a leather satchel, worn soft at the corners, filled with tinctures and dried herbs, bandages rolled tight, a lancet, and a small brown bottle of laudanum she rationed like gold. That satchel was, in a very real sense, everything she had left of who she used to be before the fever took her mother and her father's grief took him not long after. She had heard from a trapper in Missoula that there was a cabin somewhere along the pass, built into the shoulder of the mountain by a man who kept mostly to himself. The trapper had said it with a shrug, the way men said things about other men they did not understand and did not care to. Julia had filed the information away the way she filed away most things, useful and otherwise, and when the storm came down on her with a violence she had not thought possible outside of a nightmare, she remembered it, and she turned her mule off the trail and up into the trees, praying to a God she was not certain was listening. The mule went down in a drift up to its belly, not a quarter-mile from where the cabin, unbeknownst to her, stood waiting. Julia pulled her satchel free before the animal could roll and crush it, and she left the mule bawling in the snow because there was nothing else to be done, and she pressed forward on foot with the wind screaming past her ears, and the cold already working its way into her boots like a living thing. She did not know, could not have known, that she was walking in almost exactly the right direction, that some old instinct or some mercy of God had turned her feet toward warmth instead of away from it. She saw the light before she saw the cabin itself, a single small square of amber glowing through the white chaos of the storm, and she staggered toward it with the last of her strength, her lungs burning, her hands past feeling. She struck the door with her fist, or she believed she did, though later Grant Weston would tell her that what he heard was barely a whisper of sound beneath the wind, and that it was some other sense entirely, some old hunter's awareness of a change in the world outside his walls, that brought him up out of his chair and to the door with his rifle already in hand. He opened it to find her collapsing forward into the space where a threshold should have been, and he caught her before she hit the floor. Grant Weston was 31 years old that winter, and he had lived alone in that cabin for 6 years, ever since he had come west after the war and found that the mountains were the only place large enough and quiet enough to hold what he had brought back with him. He was a big man, built from years of felling timber and running trap lines, and hauling his own water and wood through snow that would have broken lesser men, with shoulders that filled a doorway and forearms corded with muscle beneath the rolled sleeves of his wool shirt. His hair had grown long over the years of solitude, dark and shot through with a few threads of premature gray at the temples, and he wore a beard that he kept close-cropped more out of habit than vanity. His eyes were a pale gray-blue, the color of ice on a lake in the last light of day, and they had a way of looking at a person, or a thing, or a stretch of empty mountain, as though he were bracing himself for it to hurt him. He carried Julia Hale to the bed that stood against the far wall of the cabin, and he pulled the wet cloak from her body, and he worked her frozen boots free of her feet with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size, and he built up the fire until the small room roared with heat and light. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her except that she was a woman, alone, half dead from the cold, and that some old part of him, some part that had not spoken in years, told him that he would not let her die in his house. Julia woke sometime past midnight with the fire still burning and every part of her body aching in a way that told her with some relief that she was alive to feel it. She opened her eyes to see the cabin's low ceiling, the rough-hewn beams, and then she turned her head and saw him. He was sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, not touching her, but near enough that he could reach her if she needed him, and he was watching her with an expression she could not immediately place. It was not quite suspicion, and it was not quite tenderness, but some uneasy country that lay between the two. "You are awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, a voice unused to speaking, like a hinge that needed oil. "I am," Julia said, and found her own voice a thin, cracked thing. "Where am I?" "My cabin, Bitterroot Pass. You near froze to death outside my door." He paused, and something in his jaw worked as though he were deciding whether to say the next thing. "I thought you were dead when I opened the door. You were not breathing right." Julia pushed herself up on one elbow, wincing at the pull of muscles gone stiff with cold and exhaustion. "My mule," she said. "I left my mule in the snow." "Mule's dead," Grant said, with the flat honesty of a man who did not know how to soften bad news. "Found it this morning when the wind let up enough to see. I am sorry." Julia closed her eyes for a moment, grieving the animal in the quiet, efficient way she had learned to grieve most things since her parents had died, and then she opened them again and looked at the man who had saved her life. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving me out there." Grant looked away from her toward the fire as though the gratitude embarrassed him. "Wouldn't leave a dog out in that," he said, "man or woman." "I am Julia Hale," she told him. "I am a midwife and I know some healing arts. I was traveling to a town further west, though I confess I do not entirely recall which one, now that I am trying to think of it." "Grant Weston," he said. "This is as far west as I go these days." She studied him in the firelight, this large, quiet man with the careful hands and the wary eyes, and she felt the beginnings of a curiosity that would, though she did not know it yet, change the entire shape of her life. There was something wrong in him, something she could see the way she could see illness in a patient before they had even named their symptoms to her, a wrongness that lived not in his body, which seemed strong and whole, but in the set of his shoulders and the guarded distance he kept even sitting still in a chair in his own home. "You are hurt somewhere," she said before she could stop herself. It was not a question. Grant's eyes came back to her, sharp and startled. "I am not hurt," he said. "I am fine." "I did not mean your body," Julia said quietly. "Forgive me. I did not mean to pry. It is only a habit of my trade to look for what ails a person." He did not answer her, and after a long moment he rose from the chair and went to check the fire, and Julia understood that she had touched something she was not meant to touch, not yet, not on the first night, and she let it lie. The storm kept its grip on the mountain for 4 more days, and in that time Julia Hale learned the shape of Grant Weston's cabin and slowly, carefully, some small pieces of the shape of the man himself. She learned that he did not sleep well, that she would wake in the night to the sound of him shifting restlessly on the pallet he had made for himself near the door, muttering words she could not quite make out, sometimes a name that was not hers, sometimes nothing at all but a low, wordless sound of distress that made her chest ache to hear it. She learned that he flinched, just slightly, at sudden loud noises, at the crack of the fire when a green log popped, at the wind slamming a shutter against the wall. She learned that he was careful, almost tender in small physical things, the way he set a cup of coffee down in front of her without letting it clatter, the way he checked twice that the blanket was tucked around her feet before he banked the fire for the night, and she began to understand that whatever wound Grant Weston carried, it had made him both harder and gentler than most men, in ways that did not cancel each other out but existed together, side by side, like 2 currents in the same river. On the 3rd day, when her strength had mostly returned, and the worst of the storm's fury had passed into a steady, quieter snow, Julia asked him about the war. They were sitting at the small table near the fire, sharing a meal of salt pork and beans that Grant had prepared with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything, and Julia had been building toward the question for the better part of an hour, turning it over in her mind, weighing whether she had earned the right to ask it. "You fought," she said finally. It was not really a question either, not the way she said it, but an offering, a door left open that he could choose to walk through or not. Grant's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "I did," he said. "For which side?" "Union, 4th Michigan." He said it the way a man recites a fact he has said so many times it has worn smooth like a stone. 4 years, Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness. I was at all of them. Julia waited. She had learned in her work that silence was often the greatest gift a healer could give, a space large enough for pain to walk into if it chose. "I do not talk about it," Grant said after a while, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he said it, as though he wished he could offer her more and did not know how. "I have not talked about it to anyone in 6 years. There is no one up here to talk to, and I have not wanted to talk to anyone down below either." "You do not have to talk about it to me," Julia said. "I only wanted you to know that I am not afraid of it, whatever it is. I have sat with a great many kinds of pain, Mr. Weston. I do not startle easily." Something in his face shifted then, some small loosening around the eyes, and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke again. "There was a boy," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very careful, like a man walking on ice he was not certain would hold. "Younger than me. 19, maybe 20. He was from my company, from near where I grew up in Ohio. We had known each other as boys. He was scared of everything, that one, scared of the guns, scared of the dark, scared of dying, and I told him I would look out for him. I told his mother before we left that I would look out for him." He stopped. Julia did not push him. Outside, the wind had settled into a low, steady moan against the eaves. "I did not look out for him," Grant said finally. "At the Wilderness. The woods caught fire from the shelling, and men were burning alive in the underbrush, and I could hear him screaming, and I could not find him in the smoke. And by the time I did—" He stopped again, and his big hands, resting on the table, had curled into fists without his seeming to notice it. "By the time I did, there was nothing left to save. I carried what there was of him out of those woods anyway. I do not know why. There was nothing to bury, not really, but I carried him out because I had told his mother." Julia felt her own eyes fill, and she did not try to hide it from him because she understood that false composure would have been its own kind of insult to what he had just given her. "I am so sorry," she said. "I do not sleep," Grant said. "Not well, not since. I hear him sometimes in the wind or in the fire when it pops. I know it is not really him. I know that. But I hear it anyway." He looked up at her, and his pale eyes were raw in a way she had not yet seen them. "I came up here because down there among people I could not stop hearing it. Up here, at least, it is only me and the mountain does not ask me why I flinch." Julia reached across the small table slowly and laid her hand over his fisted one, and after a moment she felt his fingers loosen, just slightly, beneath her touch. "That is not a wound that will simply go away because you are alone with it," she said gently. "I have seen men carry grief like that for the whole of their lives, festering, because they never let anyone near enough to help it close. I am not saying it will heal quickly or easily. But I do not think the mountain is the cure you believe it to be, Mr. Weston. I think it is only a place to hide." He did not pull his hand away, and that, Julia thought, was its own kind of answer. The days that followed the storm's end brought a change in the season and in the two of them both, slow and unspoken, but real. Julia's mule was gone, and with it any easy way for her to continue west, and though she told herself and told Grant that she would find her way to the nearest town as soon as the trails were passable, the weeks stretched on, and she found reasons to stay that had less and less to do with the snow. Grant did not ask her to leave. In fact, as the days passed, she began to see, in small ways, that he was arranging his life around the fact of her presence without seeming fully aware he was doing it. He built a second chair for the table, sanding the wood himself by the fire in the evenings, and when she asked him why, since they had managed well enough with the one chair and the crate he had been using before, he only shrugged and said a man ought to have proper furniture, and did not meet her eyes when he said it. He began to talk more too, in the small hours when the cabin was quiet and the fire was banked low. He told her about the farm in Ohio where he had grown up, about his father who had died of a fever before the war and his mother who had remarried and moved to Indiana, about how he had not written to her in years and did not know if she was even still living. He told her about the trapping he did in the fall, the furs he brought down to Missoula each spring to sell, the small, careful economy of his solitary life. He did not, in those first weeks, talk again about the war or about the boy in the burning woods, but Julia felt the shape of that grief in everything he did not say, and she was patient, because patience was the one skill her training had given her that she trusted absolutely. Julia, in turn, told him about her own life, about her father, a physician in Philadelphia who had taught her to read a fever in a person's eyes before it ever showed on a thermometer, who had brought her along on his rounds since she was a girl of 10 years old, carrying his bag, learning the names of herbs and the sound of a healthy heart against her ear. She told him about her mother, who had died of the same fever that swept through their neighborhood in the spring of 1874, and about how her father, a man who had spent his whole life saving others, had not been able to save the one person he most wanted to, and how the grief of that failure had taken him within the year, quietly, in his sleep, though Julia had always suspected it was his heart giving up rather than any illness she could have named. "I came west because there was nothing left for me there," she told him one evening, the two of them sitting close to the fire while the last of the season's snow ticked softly against the window pane. "My father's practice went to another physician, a man who did not want a woman underfoot, even one trained as thoroughly as I was. I had my satchel and my training, and I thought, there must be somewhere in this country that needs a person who knows how to bring a child safely into the world, or set a bone, or bring down a fever, without caring overmuch whether that person wears a skirt while she does it. There is," Grant said, "plenty of places. Whole territories without a doctor for 100 miles. That is what I am hoping to find," Julia said. "A place that needs me enough not to ask too many questions about why a woman is traveling alone with a satchel of medicines." Grant was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "You could stay here," he said, and then, as though startled by his own words, he added quickly, "I mean until the pass is clear proper. It is not safe traveling alone yet. There will be more snow before spring holds." "I know," Julia said, and did not point out that the last storm had already been nearly 2 weeks past, and the trails, while still difficult, were not so impassable as he made them sound. She understood, in the way she understood most things about this careful, wounded man, that he was not really talking about the weather. Spring came to the Bitterroot Mountains in fits and starts, the snow retreating from the lower slopes while it still clung stubbornly to the high peaks, and with it came a change in the rhythm of Grant Weston's days that Julia watched unfold with a quiet, growing wonder. He began to sing sometimes, while he worked outside splitting wood or mending the fence around the small paddock where he kept a pair of goats, an old hymn or a half-remembered ballad from his boyhood, his voice a low, untrained rumble that carried through the clear mountain air. He began to laugh, occasionally, a rusty, surprised sound, as though the muscles required for it had gone unused so long they creaked in protest, usually provoked by some dry observation of Julia's about the stubbornness of the goats or the state of his cooking. It was in early April that the first real test of what had been growing between them arrived, though neither of them yet had a name for it. A trapper named Elias Cobb, a wiry, weathered man who came through the pass twice a year on his way to and from Missoula, stopped at the cabin as he had done for years, expecting Grant's usual hospitality of a hot meal and a night's shelter before continuing on his way. He was surprised, and not entirely pleasantly, to find a woman living there. "Did not know you had taken up with company, Weston," Cobb said, eyeing Julia across the table with an expression that made her skin prickle with something between anger and unease. "Careful girl. Mountain men get strange living up here alone too long. I have known some as would not know how to treat a woman right, having forgotten how to be around people at all. Julia saw Grant's jaw tighten, saw his hands go still on the table, and she braced herself for the flinch she had come to expect from him at moments of tension, the retreat into silence and distance. Instead, Grant Weston stood up, slow and deliberate, and though he did not raise his voice, there was something in the set of his shoulders that filled the small cabin with an authority Julia had not seen in him before. "Miss Hale is a guest in my home," he said, "and she will be spoken to with respect under my roof, Elias, or you can make your camp outside in the cold same as any man who forgets his manners." Cobb blinked, clearly startled by the steel in Grant's voice, and after a moment he muttered something like an apology and turned the conversation to safer matters, the state of the trails, the price of beaver pelts in Missoula that season, and the tension in the room slowly eased. But Julia found herself watching Grant for the rest of the evening with a new kind of attention, seeing in him not only the wounded man who woke in the night with old grief on his tongue, but also the protector, the man whose instinct, when someone he cared for was threatened, however slightly, was to stand between her and the danger. That night, after Cobb had gone to sleep on a bedroll near the fire and Julia had retired to the bed that had become hers by unspoken agreement, she found Grant sitting on the cabin's small porch, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, looking out at the stars scattered thick and bright above the black shapes of the peaks. She joined him without asking, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You did not have to defend me the way you did," Julia said finally. "I have fielded worse than Elias Cobb's rudeness in my travels." "I know you have," Grant said. "That is not why I did it." "Why then?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the careful, halting quality it took on when he was working through something difficult. "Because it mattered to me," he said. "What he said to you and how he looked at you. It mattered in a way I have not let things matter to me in a long time. I have kept myself from feeling much of anything for 6 years, Julia, because feeling things is what got that boy killed and left me carrying a grief I did not know how to put down. But you being here has made me feel things I thought I had buried for good, and I do not entirely know what to do with that." It was the first time he had said her given name, and it landed between them with a weight that seemed to still the very air of the mountain night. "I do not think you have to do anything with it," Julia said softly, "except let it be true." Grant turned to look at her then, his pale eyes catching the starlight, and Julia saw in them something she had been waiting for without quite admitting it to herself, a raw, unguarded hope. "I do not know how to court a woman," he said, with a kind of rough honesty that made her chest ache with tenderness. "I have not had cause to try in a long while, and even before the war I was not much good at it. But I know that I do not want you to leave this mountain, Julia Hale, not this spring, and not any spring after this one if you would have me." Julia felt her own eyes fill, and she reached up to lay her palm against the rough plane of his jaw, feeling the scratch of his beard against her skin. "I have been waiting for you to say something like that since the second week of that storm," she admitted, laughing softly through the tears that had gathered. "I only did not want to say it first and frighten you back into your silence." Grant laughed then too, that rusty, surprised sound she had come to love, and he turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss there that was so gentle it made her breath catch. "I am not going anywhere," Julia said. "Not unless you send me away." "I will never do that," Grant said, and the certainty in his voice was the most solid thing Julia had heard from any man in all her years of wandering. Elias Cobb left the following morning, grumbling about the changed atmosphere of the cabin, but wise enough not to say anything further that might provoke Grant's temper. And once he was gone, the cabin on Bitterroot Pass settled into a new and tender rhythm, one built not around weariness and grief, but around the slow, careful architecture of two people falling in love. Grant began to court her properly, in his own way, which was to say without much grace but with enormous sincerity. He brought her the first wildflowers of the season, purple lupin and yellow arrowleaf balsam root, gathered clumsily and presented with an awkwardness that made Julia's heart swell every time. He carved her a small wooden comb from a piece of cedar, spending long evenings by the fire smoothing its teeth with a patient care that Julia recognized, with a start, as the same care he had shown when he first pulled her frozen boots from her feet. He taught her to shoot his old rifle, standing close behind her to correct the set of her shoulders, his breath warm against her ear, and though she was a poor shot at first, missing the fence post they had set up as a target by a wide margin, she found she did not mind the lessons at all, not with his hands guiding hers and his low laugh rumbling against her back. Julia, for her part, continued the slow work of drawing Grant's grief out into the light where it could finally begin to heal. She did not press him, understanding that a wound left too long untended could not be rushed toward closing, but she made space for him, night after night, to speak of what he carried, and slowly, piece by piece, he did. He told her, one evening in May, about the years immediately after the war, before he had come to the mountain, when he had drifted through half a dozen towns in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, unable to settle, unable to sleep in any bed for more than a few nights before the dreams drove him up and out into the dark. He told her about the drinking he had done in those years, though he had given it up entirely by the time he built the cabin, because he had found that whiskey did not quiet the boys screaming in his memory so much as it sharpened it into something unbearable. He told her about the loneliness of those years, a loneliness so total that the solitude of the mountain, when he finally found his way to it, had felt almost like relief. "I thought if I was alone enough," he said, "if there was no one around to remind me of what people are, of how easily they can be lost, then maybe I could stop feeling it so sharp. And it worked some. The mountain does not ask questions. It does not need anything from me I cannot give, but it also does not give anything back, Julia, not the way you do." "What do I give you?" Julia asked, genuinely curious, though her voice was soft with feeling. "A reason to want to wake up in the morning that has nothing to do with chores or survival," Grant said. "I did not know I had stopped wanting that until you gave it back to me." It was around this time, in the full flush of early summer, when the high meadows around the cabin had exploded into a riot of wildflowers, and the creek that ran below the property had swollen with snowmelt into a loud, rushing music, that Julia's medical skills were called upon in a way that would prove, in its own strange fashion, to be another turning point in her and Grant's shared story. A young couple, homesteaders named Samuel and Ada Prout, had taken up a claim in the valley below the pass some months before Julia's arrival, clearing land for a small farm with the kind of stubborn hope that drew so many families west in those years. Samuel Prout arrived at Grant's cabin on a June morning, his horse lathered with hard riding, his face gray with fear. "My wife," he gasped out, half falling from the saddle. "The baby is coming, and it is coming wrong, I think. There is too much blood, and there is no doctor nearer than Missoula, and I do not know what to do." Julia was already moving before he finished speaking, snatching up her satchel from its place by the door, checking with quick, practiced fingers that she had what she would need. "Take me to her," she said. "Now, Mr. Prout, there is no time to lose." Grant saddled his horse and Samuel's both within minutes, and the three of them rode down off the mountain at a pace that would have been reckless on any other day, Julia clinging to the saddle with one hand and her satchel with the other, her mind already running through the litany of complications that could attend a difficult birth, praying she would arrive in time to address whichever one had found Ada Prout. They found the young woman in the small, half-finished cabin at the edge of the Prout's claim, pale and frightened, her labor advanced but stalled, the baby positioned wrong, as her husband had feared. Julia set to work with the calm, focused efficiency that had been trained into her since girlhood, giving orders to Samuel to boil water and tear clean cloth into strips, talking Ada through each contraction with a steady, reassuring voice even as her hands worked to turn the child into a position, it could safely be born in. Grant stood outside the cabin during the worst of it, unable to help with the birth itself but unwilling to leave, pacing the small dirt yard with his hands clenched at his sides. And Julia would learn later that he had prayed, in that hour, more fervently than he had prayed since before the war, that God would not take this young mother the way disease and violence had taken so much else he had loved. The birth, when it finally came, was long and hard, but Julia's skill proved equal to the danger, and near midnight a boy was born, small but breathing, his cry cutting through the tense quiet of the cabin like the first bird of spring. Ada Prout wept with relief, and Samuel wept too, unashamed, and when Julia finally emerged from the cabin, exhausted and bloodied but triumphant, she found Grant waiting for her in the yard, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms without a word. "You did that," he said into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "You saved them both." "We saved them," Julia corrected gently, though she was too tired to argue the point with much force. "You got me here in time. That matters as much as anything I did inside that cabin." They rode back up the mountain in the gray hour before dawn, weary but lit from within by the shared knowledge of what they had accomplished together. And it was on that ride, with the sky beginning to pale over the eastern peaks, and the birds just beginning to stir in the pines, that Grant Weston reined in his horse and turned to look at Julia with an expression of such open, unguarded love that it stole the breath from her lungs. "I have been trying to find the words for weeks," he said, "and I do not think I have found the right ones yet, but I do not want to wait any longer to say them anyway. Julia Hale, I love you. I loved you, I think, from the moment you told me I was hurt somewhere that first night, when no one had seen that in me in 6 years. I love you, and I do not want to spend one more day of my life without you beside me." Julia's eyes filled with tears that she did not bother to blink away. "I love you too, Grant Weston," she said. "I have loved you since I watched you build me a second chair and pretend it was nothing at all." He laughed, that rough, joyful sound, and leaned across the space between their horses to kiss her, slow and sweet and full of promise, there in the pale light of the mountain dawn, with the whole of their future opening up before them like the wildflower meadows spreading out below the pass. They were married in late July, in a small ceremony held in the yard of Grant's cabin, the only guests the Prouts, still glowing with new parenthood, and a handful of other homesteaders and trappers from the surrounding valleys who had come to know and respect the quiet mountain man and the healer who had come to share his home. A traveling minister, passing through on his circuit, performed the ceremony, and Julia wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton that Ada Prout had helped her sew, and Grant wore a coat he had not worn since before the war, brushed and mended for the occasion, his long hair tied back neatly for once, though it escaped its binding by the time the vows were finished, falling loose around his face in a way that made Julia love him all the more. "I, Grant Weston, take you, Julia Hale, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Julia could see plainly in his eyes, "to love and protect, in sickness and in health, for as long as the mountain and the good Lord allow us breath." "I, Julia Hale, take you, Grant Weston," she answered, "to heal what wounds I can, and to love you through the ones that cannot be healed but only carried together, for as long as we both shall live." The small gathering cheered when the minister pronounced them married, and Grant kissed his new wife beneath the wide Montana sky with a tenderness that made even the weathered old trappers in attendance dab at their eyes. And that evening, as the sun set gold and rose over the peaks, the newlyweds stood together on the porch of the cabin that was now truly their shared home, and Julia felt, for the first time since her parents' deaths, that she had found not just a place to rest, but a person to belong to. Their first year of marriage was not without its trials. Grant's nightmares did not vanish overnight simply because he had found love. Grief of that depth, Julia had always known, does not surrender easily, even to joy. There were nights when he woke thrashing, calling out the name of the boy he had lost in the wilderness, and Julia would hold him through the aftermath, murmuring soft words, reminding him gently of where he was and who he was with, until his breathing steadied and he could sleep again. There were days, too, when some small thing, a burning smell from the cook fire, the crack of a rifle shot echoing off the mountain during hunting season, would send him into a silence so deep and sudden that Julia had learned to simply sit beside him, her hand in his, until he found his way back. But these episodes grew fewer as the months passed, and gentler in their intensity, and Julia watched with quiet joy as her husband slowly reclaimed pieces of himself he had thought lost forever to the war. He wrote that autumn a long letter to his mother in Indiana, the first he had sent in years, and when a reply came back in the spring, full of relief and love and news of half-siblings he had never met, Grant wept openly at the table, and Julia held him, and understood that this too was a kind of healing. She continued her work as a healer throughout that first year, her reputation growing steadily among the scattered homesteads and small settlements of the valley below the pass. Word traveled, as word does in sparsely populated country, of the skilled midwife living up at the Weston place, and Julia found herself called upon with increasing frequency to attend births, set broken bones, treat fevers and infections, and dispense the herbal remedies she had carried west in that same worn satchel that had accompanied her through the storm that first brought her to Grant's door. She kept careful records of her cases, in the manner her father had taught her, and more than once she found herself grateful for the thoroughness of her training when faced with an injury or illness that might otherwise have overwhelmed a less experienced healer. Grant, for his part, became something of a fixture at her side during the more difficult cases, driving the wagon they had purchased that spring to fetch her quickly when a call came, and standing watch outside whatever cabin or homestead she was tending, the way he had stood outside the Prute's door on that first fateful night. The people of the valley came to know him not as the strange, silent mountain man Elias Cobb had once implied he was, but as Julia Hale's husband, a good and steady man whose devotion to his wife's work was plain in every anxious pace of his boots outside a laboring woman's door. It was in the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after that first blizzard had thrown them together, that Julia discovered she was carrying a child of her own, and she told Grant the news on a morning much like the one on which they had first exchanged their vows of love, the mountain air crisp and clean, the wildflowers just beginning their annual eruption of color across the high meadows. Grant's reaction to the news was a thing Julia would treasure for the rest of her life. He went very still, his pale eyes widening, and then he let out a whoop of joy so loud it startled the goats in their paddock and sent them scattering, and he lifted Julia clean off her feet in an embrace that left her laughing and breathless. "A child," he said, setting her down gently, his large hands coming to rest with sudden, careful tenderness against the still flat plane of her stomach. "Our child, Julia." "Our child," she confirmed, covering his hands with her own. "I hope he has your steadiness and not my tendency to fuss over every small thing." "I hope she has your kindness," Grant said, "and none of the fool stubbornness that kept me up on this mountain alone for 6 years before you came and knocked some sense into me." They laughed together, and that laughter, Julia thought, was its own kind of medicine, better than anything in her satchel, a healing that no tincture or poultice could have accomplished on its own. The pregnancy was not without its worries, as pregnancies in that remote country so often were, far from any proper hospital or trained physician beyond Julia's own skill. But Julia had attended enough births in her years of practice to know her own body well, and she prepared carefully as her time approached, laying in supplies, writing detailed instructions for Grant in case her own hands were needed for herself rather than for a patient, and enlisting the help of Ada Prute, who had grown close to Julia in the 2 years since her own son's dramatic entrance into the world, to attend her when her labor began. The boy was born on a clear October night, with the first frost of the season silvering the meadow grass outside the cabin windows, and his arrival was, by the standards of frontier births, a relatively easy one, though Grant paced the small yard outside with an anxiety that Ada later teased him about for months afterward, claiming he had worn a visible path in the dirt by the time the baby's first cry finally sounded from within the cabin walls. They named him Thomas, after Grant's father, and Julia held him for the first time with tears streaming freely down her face, marveling at the impossible smallness of his fingers, the dark tuft of hair already showing on his head, so like his father's. Grant, when Julia finally called him in to meet his son, stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, his big frame trembling with an emotion too large for words, before he crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, taking his son's tiny hand in his own with a gentleness that Julia had come to know as the truest measure of the man he was. "Thomas Weston," he said softly, testing the name, and then he looked up at Julia with eyes bright with unshed tears. "I did not think I would ever have this, a wife, a child, a reason to want tomorrow more than yesterday. You gave me all of it, Julia. You walked out of a blizzard and gave me back my whole life." "You saved me first," Julia reminded him gently. "I would have died in that storm if you had not opened your door." "Then I suppose we saved each other," Grant said, and pressed a kiss to his son's small forehead, and then to Julia's lips, and the little family sat together in the fire-lit warmth of the cabin while outside the first snow of the coming winter began, softly, to fall. Life on the mountain settled, in the years that followed, into a rhythm of work and love that suited both Grant and Julia in ways neither had thought possible before they found each other. Thomas grew from infancy into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father around the property with a solemn determination that made Grant laugh more often than Julia had ever seen him laugh in those early days of their acquaintance. Grant expanded the cabin that second year, adding a second room to accommodate their growing family, working through the long summer evenings with a joy in the labor that Julia recognized as another sign of his continued healing. The man who had once built walls to keep the world out was now building rooms to hold more of it in. Julia's medical practice continued to grow as well, and in 1882 she was instrumental in helping establish a small clinic in the growing town that had sprung up at the base of the pass, a settlement that had begun to call itself Weston's Crossing in informal recognition of the family, whose homestead marked the route most travelers took through the mountains. It was not an official designation, nothing so grand as a proper town charter, but the name stuck the way such names do in frontier country, passed from traveler to traveler until it became simply true. The clinic allowed Julia to treat patients in a proper, dedicated space for the first time since she had left Philadelphia, and though she still traveled to attend difficult births or emergencies too urgent to wait for a patient to come to her, the clinic became the center of a network of care that extended throughout the valley, staffed eventually by a young woman named Susanna Cole, who had come west following her own hard journey and had found in Julia both a mentor and a friend. Learning the healing arts much as Julia herself had once learned them from her father. Grant, meanwhile, had begun to speak occasionally, when asked with kindness by the townsfolk who had come to respect him, of his experiences in the war, a small but meaningful sign of how far his healing had progressed since that first winter with Julia. He never spoke of it easily, and there remained always a shadow in his eyes when the subject arose, a grief that Julia understood would never fully leave him, not entirely, but it no longer ruled him the way it once had. He slept through most nights now without the old nightmares finding him, and when they did come, rare as they had become, he no longer needed to face them alone in the dark, wondering if the wind outside was screaming with a dead boy's voice. He had Julia beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness, her steady presence a reminder that he had survived, and more than survived, had found a life worth all the grief it had cost him to reach it. In 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Margaret after Julia's mother, and the following spring the town of Weston's Crossing celebrated the opening of a proper schoolhouse, built with lumber that Grant himself had helped fell and shape, a project he had undertaken with a fierce dedication that spoke to how much the future of that small mountain community, and his own children's place within it, had come to mean to him. It was on the day of the schoolhouse's dedication, with the whole small community gathered in the crisp spring air, Thomas, now a lanky boy of nearly 4 years old, holding his father's hand and baby Margaret asleep against Julia's shoulder, that Grant turned to his wife with an expression of quiet wonder that she had seen grow more frequent in him over the years of their marriage, a look that said, plainly, that he still could not quite believe the good fortune that had found him on that terrible, beautiful night so many winters ago. "Do you remember," he said, "what you told me that first night when I asked you nothing and you told me anyway that I was hurt somewhere?" "I remember," Julia said, smiling. "I have thought about it often," Grant said. "How strange it was that a stranger could see in a moment what I had spent 6 years trying to hide from everyone, including myself. I used to think that if anyone truly saw the wreck of me, they would run from it. Instead, you walked toward it, satchel and all, and you have been walking toward me ever since." "That is what love does, I think," Julia said, leaning into him as Margaret stirred softly against her shoulder. "It does not ask us to hide our wounds. It only asks us to let someone help carry them." Grant pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and together they watched their son run off to join a cluster of other children exploring the new schoolhouse, his laughter carrying bright and clear across the mountain air, a sound that, 6 years before, Grant Weston could not have imagined would ever fill his solitary world, and now could not imagine living without. The years continued to unfold with the steady, gentle rhythm of a life well and truly lived. Weston's Crossing grew, slowly but surely, from a scattering of homesteads into a proper small town, with a general store and a church, and eventually, a proper doctor who came to work alongside Julia at the clinic she had founded, a partnership that allowed her more time at home with her growing family, while still ensuring the community she loved had access to the care they needed. Grant expanded his trapping business into a modest but respectable trade in furs and lumber, and in time he was elected, somewhat to his own bemused surprise, as one of the town's first council members, a role that required him to speak in public more than he had ever imagined comfortable for a man who had once gone 6 years without more than a handful of conversations, but which he took to with a quiet, steady competence that earned him the respect of his neighbors. Their family grew as well. In 1886, a third child arrived, another son they named William, and 2 years after that a fourth, a daughter named Rose, born in the same room where Thomas had first drawn breath, attended by Julia's own trusted hands even as she labored, with Susanna Cole assisting and Grant, ever faithful to his post, pacing the yard outside despite having now done this 4 times before, unable, it seemed, to ever fully quiet the anxious love that gripped him each time his wife brought new life into the world. It was Thomas, the eldest, who eventually asked the question that Grant and Julia had both, in some quiet way, been waiting for one of their children to ask, sitting around the fire one winter evening when he was perhaps 12 years old and had begun to notice, in the way children do, the small mysteries that surrounded him. "Papa," he said, "why did you live up here all alone before Mama came? Was it lonesome?" Grant looked across the fire at Julia, and something passed between them, an old understanding, and then he looked back at his son, and answered with an honesty that Julia knew had taken him years to be able to offer so freely. "I lived up here because I had been in the war, Thomas, and the war left some wounds in me that I did not think anyone could see or understand or help me carry. So I hid myself away on this mountain, thinking that if I was alone enough, the wounds could not hurt anyone but me. And it was lonesome, yes, terribly lonesome. But I did not know any other way to live, until your mother walked out of a blizzard and into my life, and showed me that some wounds heal faster in company than they ever could alone. Thomas considered this with the grave seriousness children sometimes bring to matters they only half understand. "Are you still wounded, Papa?" "Some," Grant admitted. "I think some wounds never close up entirely, not all the way. But your mother taught me that a wound like that does not have to keep you from living a full and happy life. It only has to be tended, now and again, with love. And I have had more love in this house than I ever thought I would find, son, in these mountains or anywhere else." Julia, listening to this exchange with tears standing bright in her eyes, reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her husband's hand, and Grant lifted it to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that had lost none of its intensity in all the years since that first winter. And their children, watching, absorbed without quite realizing it, a lesson about love and healing that would stay with them long after they had grown and left the mountain themselves to build their own lives in the wider world. By 1895, 17 years after that fateful blizzard had first thrown Julia Hale into Grant Weston's path, the mountain man and the healer had built a life together that neither could have imagined possible in the depths of their separate griefs. Hers for the parents she had lost, his for the boy in the burning wilderness and the 6 lonely years that had followed. Their children were growing into adulthood. Thomas had taken over much of his father's trapping and timber business, showing the same steady competence and quiet strength that had always defined Grant, while Margaret had followed in her mother's footsteps, training under Susanna Cole to become a healer in her own right, carrying forward the legacy of care that Julia had brought west so many years before in that worn leather satchel, now itself worn even further with the passage of time and use, though Julia had never once considered replacing it. Weston's Crossing had grown into a thriving small town. Its schoolhouse expanded twice to accommodate a growing population of families drawn by the promise of good land and honest work. Its church home to a congregation that had, over the years, come to include nearly every family in the valley. The town's founding, in the informal way such things happen, was still spoken of by the old-timers as beginning with the mountain man and the healer who had built their cabin at the top of the pass. And there was a particular pride in the community's memory of how Julia Hale had ridden down from that cabin in the dead of night to save Ada Prout and her infant son. An act of courage and skill that had, in its own small way, marked the beginning of the town's belief in itself as a place worth building. On a warm evening in late summer of that year, Grant and Julia sat together on the porch of their cabin, much as they had on that first spring night so many years before, watching the sun set gold and rose over the peaks while their grandchildren, Thomas's own 2 young ones, played in the meadow grass below, their laughter drifting up on the evening air. "Do you ever think," Julia asked, her head resting against her husband's broad shoulder, his arm around her as it had been countless evenings before, about how different everything might have been if that storm had never come? Grant considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything, his hair now more gray than dark, but his shoulders, even at 51 years old, still broad and strong from a lifetime of honest labor. "I think about it," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing everything, without ever having had the chance to know what I was losing. I think about how I might have grown old alone on this mountain, hearing that boy's voice in the wind until the day I died, never knowing there was a woman out there who could have shown me how to finally let it go." "But the storm did come," Julia said softly. "The storm did come," Grant agreed, "and it brought me the only thing that has ever truly healed me, Julia. Not medicine, though God knows your satchel has saved more lives in this valley than I can count. Not time, though time has helped soften what could not be cured outright. It was you. It was always going to be you, I think, whatever storm it took to bring you to my door." Julia lifted her face to his, and Grant kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown her on their wedding day, deepened now by decades of shared life, shared grief, shared joy, and shared healing. and below them in the meadow their grandchildren's laughter continued to rise on the warm evening air, a sound as sweet and as certain as any promise either of them had ever made. They grew old together on that mountain, Grant Weston and Julia Hale, watching their children marry and have children of their own, watching the small town they had helped found grow into a permanent fixture on the maps of Montana Territory, and later, after 1889, the young state itself. Grant's nightmares in time faded almost entirely, the old grief transformed by decades of love and purpose into something he could carry without being crushed beneath its weight, a scar rather than an open wound, tender still in certain lights but no longer capable of controlling the shape of his days. Julia continued to practice her healing arts well into her later years, training first Margaret, and then, eventually, one of her granddaughters in the skills her own father had first taught her in Philadelphia so long before, ensuring that the legacy she had carried west in her satchel would continue to serve the people of that mountain valley for generations to come. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the fire was burning low in the cabin that had grown, over the years, from a single lonely room into a home filled with the warmth of a large and loving family, Grant Weston would sometimes take his wife's hand, the same hand that had once reached across a small table to cover his own clenched fist on the worst night of his long isolation, and he would tell her, as he had told her 1,000 times before and would tell her 1,000 times again before either of them drew their last breath, that she had saved his life twice, once from the storm that would have killed her outside his door, and once from the far longer, far colder storm that had been slowly killing him from the inside for 6 lonely years before she arrived. "I did not have a name for what ailed me," he told her once, near the very end of both their long lives, when their hair had gone entirely silver and their children's children had children of their own. "I only knew that something in me was broken, and had been broken so long I had stopped believing it could be fixed. You never asked me to name it, Julia. You only stayed and loved me and let the naming come in its own time. I think that is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "You gave me a gift too," Julia reminded him, as she always did when he spoke this way, her voice as steady and certain in old age as it had been on that first terrible, beautiful night. "You gave me a door to walk through when I had nowhere else to go, and a home when I thought I had lost the very idea of one, and a love I did not know I was still capable of feeling until you showed me otherwise. We saved each other, Grant. We always did. From the very first night, and every night after until this one." And there, on that mountain where a blizzard had once brought 2 wounded souls together against all reasonable odds, Grant Weston and Julia Hale lived out the whole of their long, rich, deeply loved lives, their story becoming in time a piece of the mountain's own history, told and retold by the families of Westons crossing for generations, a story of healing and love found in the unlikeliest of places, carried always at its heart by a satchel of remedies and a mountain man who had at long last found someone able to name and heal the wound he had carried for so long alone.